Hi everyone, my name is Nick Record. I'm from Bigelow Laboratory in East Boothbay, Maine in the US. And I want to give a talk today about reproducible research in ocean data science, or as I like to call it, a gift to your future self. So to start with, of course you're here, you're working with data and code, maybe some analysis of big data or machine learning and AI, maybe you're doing simulation modeling. Anyway, you could be doing all kinds of things, but it's really important to be thinking about reproducibility and how you're writing your code or your analysis or your simulations. And one of the main reasons for this is because right now we're in what people are calling a reproducibility crisis in science. And it cuts across a lot of different sciences, but it has some particular dimensions in data science and in ocean data science. And what I want to talk about are some of the tools that you can use for data science and ocean data science in particular that can help you think about reproducibility. And the more you think about reproducibility early on in your research, the more you're going to thank yourself later on, which is why I call it a gift to your future self. Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge some talks that I drew some content from for this. So first, Joseph Gum as part of OceanHackWeek, and also Kath Mitchell as part of Bigelow Labs' Cafe Code program, and you can see the links there. And check out those videos if you're interested. So to start off with, I mentioned something called the reproducibility crisis. There are a growing number of studies that do things like meta-analysis, where they look across lots and lots of other studies to find patterns in how science is done. And the more we do this, the more we are finding problems with how science is conducted. This particular paper even argues that most medical research findings are false. And it really highlights the problem with reproducibility in science and the need for good reproducibility. So whether or not you agree with this particular provocative finding, there are definitely some systemic problems that we need to think about. Just to list a few examples, there is a documented bias toward publishing statistically significant results and leaving out negative results, which are often lost to filing cabinets and to the mists of time. There are also plenty of instances of cherry-picking results to get into top journals. And there have been some really high-profile examples, actually quite a lot of them, and I'll highlight them, some of them, in a few minutes. In general, this problem was examined in detail in a recent report from the National Academy of Sciences, and they highlighted a lot of concerns about reproducibility and replicability in research. This document, which is linked below, has a whole bunch of recommendations. But thinking about data science and coding, there are some particular ones that I'd like to highlight. So one of them was funding open source usable tools and infrastructure for reproducibility, and that's something that we'll talk a little bit about. There are recommendations for code and data repositories. That's something we'll touch on as well. And then journals and societies to set progressive 3R policies for submissions, and I'll explain what 3R means in just a minute. So what is reproducibility and what are those three R's that I just mentioned? 3 R's in science, so we have repeatability, when you have the same research team and the same experimental setup. Replicability, when you have a different team trying to get the same result through the same experimental setup. And reproducibility means you can have a different research team with a different experimental setup and get the same result. These definitions, you can think about them differently in terms of methods, results, and inference. They also mean something a little bit different with data and modeling type of sciences, which we'll talk about. But if you want to dig in deeper into these definitions, there's a link to a paper below. In terms of reproducibility, why is it important to us? So a big reason is scientific integrity. You get increased rigor, increased quality of scientific outputs, and greater trust in science. When you don't have reproducibility, you have things like paper retractions. And there's this great website, Retraction Watch. You can check it out and see what some of the recent retractions have been. I've pasted some here. But there are new bullet points popping up all the time on this site, and you can get a sense for some of the reproducibility mistakes that people are making leading to their papers being retracted. And a lot of them have to do with good, or I should say bad, data practices. So for example, a lot of them have to do with spreadsheets. Here's one where attempted spreadsheet merge totally changed the conclusion of a paper. So they had to retract the paper, fix their spreadsheet merge, and they wound up with this revised conclusion. So everything was done in a transparent and open way, but these checks on reproducibility are what found the error eventually. Here's another one where this was a study on seizures, and the data got all mixed up, and the authors had to retract the study. And you can read more about these at the links that I'm showing. Here is one by a Nobel laureate, actually, who had to retract a paper because of non-reproducibility. And just to highlight one more, there's this great video on how using Excel spreadsheets leads to myriads of errors and problems in reproducible science. There's a link to a great YouTube video there by a mathematician who's also a comedian, and I encourage you to check out that video, and there are links to other great videos on similar topics. So just a couple of other reasons why it's important to think about reproducibility. Well, in coding and data science, the reproducibility methods that I'll talk about are really great at facilitating collaboration. They have to do with sharing code, sharing data, and this is a great way to bring people together in science, which is becoming more and more collaborative as time goes on. And then finally, another reason to keep reproducibility in mind is because of open science. There are more and more requirements now from funding agencies as well as from journals and so on to share your data and code. So the other reason to think about reproducibility in this sense is that in a lot of cases you're required to do it. And if you think about it at the beginning of a project rather than toward the end, you will thank yourself. Before I get into some of the reproducibility tools that you can start to use, I just want to show you a short activity that you can do. It's optional. If you have some time, you can do this with a partner. And I found this activity at the link on the lower right, this reproducible science curriculum site on GitHub, if you want to read more about it. Basically, you will find this spreadsheet, Gapminder. I've posted it at this link on GitHub if you want to download it. Both you and your partner will download this and then individually try to do the tasks in 1 and 2 here. So visualize life expectancy over time for Canada in the 1950s and 60s using a line plot. There are these stretch goals. If you have some more time, add lines for Mexico and the US. And then another visualization task. And you can use any software, any coding language, whatever you're used to using, and just try to do these things. And what you're going to do is write instructions and documentations, the steps that you use to produce those visualizations. Then you give your instructions to your collaborator, and they give their instructions to you, and you try to see if you can reproduce their work without talking to each other. If you need to get some additional software, you can do that, like if your partner needs the software. And then at the end of it, you see how close you came to reproducing the visualization or the figure or the plot that your partner produced. And talk to each other about challenges you faced and so on. And I have found this exercise to be really eye-opening in terms of how hard it is to, even when you have really good instructions, to follow someone's instructions and reproduce the same figure that someone else did. And here are just some guiding questions that you can reflect on when you're done with the activity. Even if you don't have time to do the activity, it's worth reading through those as you start to think about what reproducibility means and what are some of the challenges involved. Okay, so next I'm going to go through some reproducibility best practices. These are some tips that you can use. I put a question mark after best because these are some general ideas, but you probably will make some decisions yourself about your own preferences, and this is just supposed to be some general guidance. So I'm going to go through 4 kind of areas: documentation, organization, automation, and dissemination. So let's start with documentation. So first of all, as you start doing more and more coding, it's a really good practice to just start documenting everything. You might be developing protocols or workflows, any figures that you created, doing simulations, that sort of thing. Make sure you're documenting it. And to do that, you will probably want to use something like an electronic lab book, or text documents is a simpler way to go. If you're using electronic lab books, there's a wide range of options from the sort of all singing, all dancing, expensive but comprehensive types of tools. There are simpler note-taking examples that I've listed here. And if you're doing interactive computing, this is a great way to link the code that you're writing with the documenting that you're doing. So for example, R Markdown or Jupyter Notebooks, where you have code and explanation of what you just did written together in the same place. That's a really good way to document things along with the coding that you're doing. It doesn't work in every case, but it's something that I definitely recommend you give it a try. And of course, there are options like simple text documents, such as text editors, Notepad, text edit, things like that. Or if you want, you could use things like word processors. My preference is to use tools that are linked well with the coding that you're writing, such as Markdown languages. Okay, in terms of organization, before you know it, you're going to have more and more files that you know what to do with. You could put all of those files into a folder for a project, but if you don't think about things beforehand, it's easy to make a big mess. So you want to start thinking about your file organization early on in your project. That's not to say you can't change things as you go, but it's a really good practice to think about how you want to organize things. So some points to keep in mind. In terms of your file naming, you want to be consistent. You want your file names to be computer readable as well as human understandable. So in terms of computer readability, don't use spaces in your file name. Try to use an underscore or a hyphen instead. That way, it's a lot easier for programming languages to read in the file names. Spaces can be kind of a pain when you're trying to write those file names into code. It can confuse a lot of coding languages. And if you're wanting to sort files or perhaps loop through files in your code, it's really handy to use some kind of format like this if your files have a year, a month, and a day associated with them, or some kind of ordered indexing like that. And this will make it easier to find files and understand what they mean. So remember, your closest collaborator is your future self. And it won't be too long before you forget what you did 6 months ago, and this will make things a lot easier. Your future self will thank your past self, as I keep on saying. And like I said earlier, these are just general ideas to guide you. You'll find something that works for you. There's not a uniform standard that's been agreed upon here. This is just some tips to think about. So some examples of what a directory structure might look like. So here's a nice expressive project here where you have a subdirectory for any scripts that you might be writing, and they're numbered in this case in terms of different analysis that the person did. You might have a separate folder for the data. Always keep your raw data, keep a version of your raw data that is unchanged by any analysis or simulation that you're doing so that you can always go back to the original raw data. And then you might have different types, different dates. Another folder for output graphics, so something at the end of your analysis that you're doing that might go into a report or a paper, that sort of thing. And then another directory for the final paper. And this is just one example. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it this way, but thinking about a structure like this will be really helpful in sharing your research with someone else or sharing it with your future self and just reproducing the steps that you took to get your results. And then on the right here is an example of a non-expressive project. It's hard to tell what's going on. You can see some of the file names are not very well explained, and there are different file types here and so on. And there are only 8 files in this directory, but you can imagine that if this project has been going on for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, it will start to get really hard to figure out what's going on, and definitely really hard to reproduce any results that came out of that project. Here's just another example of a directory structure. You might have a project name. It's always a good practice to have a README. This could be at the top of the directory. You might have a README file within data directories. You might have a README file within analysis, though probably you're documenting things, like I said, within this directory. And then a publications file. So a similar directory structure, but maybe written in a more generic way. You can see process data has this nice year, month, day numbering to it, so everything will wind up being sorted sequentially. All of these things are just ideas to help you think about how you want to organize your code, your data, and the other files in your project. Automation. So the more steps you have automated in your project, the more reproducible it will be. If you have steps in there where you're pointing and clicking and sort of have to redo things on your own each time, if someone else comes along to reproduce your steps, that will be really hard to do. If you decided to do the exercise that I explained earlier on in this talk, you'll have a really good sense for how hard that can be. So you want to think about developing methods as small reusable chunks. These can be functions or scripts, but pieces of code that you might use again and again for different purposes that are well documented and well explained. So for example, you might have some functions or scripts for cleaning data, some for making figures, some for doing particular types of analysis that you might do in different contexts, or running a type of simulation, that sort of thing. And again, there's no one size fits all. You'll want to think about the best tool for the job you're trying to do. If you're working with spreadsheets, and sometimes it's unavoidable, like I said earlier, spreadsheets can often lead to hidden errors, especially if you're using a proprietary software like Excel. But if you are using spreadsheets, you can think about tools like OpenRefine, and I have a link in a later slide to this tool. It helps clean up messy data so that when you pass it to other people or when you load it in into different programming environments, there aren't these sort of translation errors. And it also tracks every step you do cleaning up data so that everything will be reproduced if someone else tries to do it. If you are going to have Excel files, it's good practice to have a README with them so that if someone else were using that data file, they would be able to follow your steps. Make sure you document how you're creating all of your figures. And like I said earlier, always keep an unchanged version of the raw data. Now, if you're coding, a good way to do automation is to use functions, particularly for tasks that you do a lot of times, because functions are really flexible. They're very modular, and you can pass them around to different tasks easily. You know exactly what's going in and exactly what's coming out. For making figures, it's great to have a single script or a single workflow that goes all the way from the raw data to the final figure. That way, say you're submitting your results for publication to a journal, the journal reviewers, probably reviewer number 3, will come back and say, I don't like this, I think it should be done this other way. Instead of having to refigure out everything that you've done, you've got that entire workflow in one place, and you can find exactly what needs to be changed, make a little change, and then you've got your new updated figure, and you can answer reviewer number 3 really easily. So things are reproducible. And it's especially easy, like if you don't have to go into a post-editing software like Photoshop or some other image editing because when you do have to make changes to that figure, you'll have to go into that figure editing software every time and point and click and do all of these steps. Whereas if you have scripts making your figures going from the raw data to the final output, you don't have to do all of those steps again and again as different people, such as reviewers, are requesting changes. And then finally, just a couple of tips on dissemination. We're usually in science, we're sharing our research through journal articles, poster presentations, oral presentations, that sort of thing. Using reference managers to track citations can be really useful. That's not so much a point about reproducibility, but just a tip to save you some work later on. And just thinking about reproducibility in general, scripting things, coding, automating every step will make it easier for yourself to redo figures or redo analysis, those sorts of things. A couple of other things to think about. Often we need to share our data in online repositories. I'm going to talk a little bit about a coding repository in a minute that a lot of people are using. And for our research to be truly reproducible, our methods need to be shared. So scripts, coding, workflows, those sorts of things. And the best way to do that is through repositories. So just some takeaways to take with you. Number one, make sure you're documenting everything. The more you document, the more reproducible your work will be. Number two, organize your project directories to make them easier to understand. This is something that you'll probably hone over time. You might revisit your choices for organizational structure and that sort of thing. But the point is to be deliberate and put some thought into how you organize things. Number three, make things simple on yourself. So I'll say it again. Your closest collaborator is you 6 months ago, but you 6 months ago don't reply to email. So write things down and you'll thank yourself later on. And then finally, find a system that works for you, your project, your research group, anyone you could imagine collaborating with, basically. If you want to get deeper into any of these ideas, there's a great paper here in PLOS Computational Biology, 10 Simple Rules for Reproducible Computational Research. So it's reproducibility, but really tuned into computational research in sort of biological sciences. And I've listed the 10 simple rules here, but I recommend downloading this paper and reading through the explanations of all of these rules, and that will help guide you and have some really good reproducibility practices. A few online resources, and you can explore these links. I mentioned OpenRefine earlier. Here's the link to that tool. So if you are using spreadsheets a lot, that's something to look into. So I'm going to finish with some specific resources that are useful for ocean data science. These are some slides, again, from Joseph. You can see the link in the lower right where you can see the full slide deck. I'm just going to highlight a few of his slides. But it starts out with this nice little quiz, and if you can answer all of these questions, you're probably all set. But it talks about things like knowing what a repository is, where do you give and get data from, knowing what version control is, FAIR principles, and so on. But it all gets down to interoperability and reproducibility. I'll just start with these FAIR principles. This is a way to make data easier to use, and it's a whole list of guidelines to improve findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. That's the FAIR in FAIR. It's designed around data, but the same idea applies to code as well. And this guidelines list is really long. Realistically, you're probably not going to meet all of the guidelines, but it's something to aspire to. And just think about when you make data or code, when you're sharing it, are you making it, in general, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? To complement the FAIR principles is this other set of principles called the CARE principles. And this has largely come out of the world of data justice, where people have come to understand that open data isn't necessarily a universally beneficial thing. For example, issues around data privacy and surveillance, and these can apply certainly in ocean sciences as well. And so the CARE principles focus on things like who is benefiting from the data, should it be open? Who has the authority or data sovereignty? Who's responsible? Where is the accountability in the algorithms that are written, and questions about ethics? So if you're thinking about making everything open and accessible, you should also be thinking about who is that open and accessible data impacting, and are those impacts generally positive or negative, or do you have to think a little bit more deeply about it? And if anyone is interested in issues around data justice, this has become a growing area of my own research, and I encourage you to reach out to me. I would love to chat about it. There are a few data centers that it's good to be aware of if you're doing ocean data science or modeling. Just a few of them are shown here at the bottom. You're probably going to be working with different data centers all around the world, different environments around the world as you get more steeped in ocean data science. And some things to think about: while data centers are paid to make your data available, or to make other people's data available to you, and you should definitely reach out and contact them, and they will make things as easy as possible for you. So don't be a stranger. And just a note, it's also a requirement of many grants to submit your data to these data centers and repositories. If you are accessing data from data centers, they use libraries to read data, or if they don't have libraries, they can make them. And that will make things really easy for coding and accessing data and so on. And you can also contribute to those libraries in a lot of cases. Here are just a few other organizations to be aware of and links. There's a lot more than what's listed here, but if you're thinking about FAIR principles or ocean best practices or so on. Just to highlight ocean best practices, these are also, in addition to repositories of data, they're also repositories of methods. You can get DOIs. A DOI is a digital object identifier for manuals and handbooks. It could relate to fieldwork, modeling, etc. Just ways of writing up best practices in ways that make research, again, reproducible. And some of these are internationally agreed upon standards. Many of them have their own journals that you could even publish these best practices in. So be aware of those, and there's a link at the bottom there. So I generally finish this talk with a walkthrough of GitHub, but if you've made it this far in Ocean Hack Week, you should be pretty well versed with what GitHub is and what it can do. And if you're just starting with it, there's probably a lot more that you're discovering along the way. So I'll just leave this slide here and the comic for you to enjoy. So just a couple final resources for you to take away. The Carpentries Project is a great program for learning tools for writing software, working with data in different languages at all different levels. And what's neat about the Carpentries is you can also learn how to become a Carpentries instructor and then sort of spread the word that way. Of course, there's OceanHackWeek, which we've been running for a few years, and I certainly hope you stay involved beyond this week. We've had some really great year-to-year collaborations develop, and the longer you're involved, the more you get out of it, really. And then just one final thing I wanted to mention. So NASA has this Year of Open Science, this TOPS program, Transform to Open Science, and there's going to be a series of workshops and things like that for this goal of transforming to open science in the coming year. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks.